Well, I'm Rick Timbs. I'm Executive Director of the Statewide School Finance Consortium. I was the District Superintendent of the Erie 2 Chautauqua Cattaraugus BOCES. So I'm very familiar with Cassadaga Valley and actually all of Erie County because I was born in Niagara Falls, New York. Right? My school's now a Walmart. It was LaSalle. And I live in New Hartford, New York, right near Marcy, New York. So who knew? You're probably a couple miles away from me, Erica. But anyway, I was a K-12 social studies, or I shouldn't say it, 7 through 12 social studies teacher, principal, assistant superintendent for business and instruction, assistant superintendent for business, and one for instruction. I was a superintendent of Oriskany Central School. This is my old haunt right near Marcy. So I see some of my old buddies every now and then. And then I was a superintendent of Spencerport Central School District as well and retired out of Erie 2 BOCES. I also have a finance corporation that I run to help school districts with their finances and capital projects. For instance, Niagara Wheatfield is a client of mine. Okay, so I know we have someone who works at Niagara Wheatfield. I guess we can get started then, Chuck. I guess they know about me, so why don't let's talk state aid. Okay, let's go to the first slide and let's see if we can run over this slide here. Okay, the next one. There we go. Well, I don't know if you could obviously see that I've got some things kind of highlighted here, but we've got about $27 million, a little over $27 billion in state aid. And what I've tried to do is show you the differences between last year and this year's state aid. The ones highlighted in red are very, very important state aids. They're building aid, transportation aid, charter school, transitional, BOCES, pre-K, and foundation. And if you'll notice, those are the largest categories really of state aid. And they're also the most volatile in some ways, except for foundation aid. Now, foundation aid is the bedrock of all state aid. So you'll see it's the largest at over $18.4 billion. Followed closely by building aid at 3.1 or 3.21 billion. And then you can start going down, see transportation and so on. And if you'll notice that these are the major aid categories, but as you go down the list, I don't know why those aren't lining up. Maybe when we PDF these things, they don't quite match up. But in mine, I'm trying to highlight a high tax aid, which is down a couple underneath the blue. There it is, high tax aid. That's another aid category that is about almost $225 million. So there's a lot of money in aid to school districts. Part of the problem we've got here is that the state aid pie, shall we say, is getting larger and larger. When we start getting into the $27 billion range, we're into a lot of money. So last year it increased right next to that $27,960 million, almost $1 billion. But not all this aid goes to everyone. For instance, those of you who are in New York City where it says non-component aid, you would get that aid, but you would not get, for instance, BOCES aid that's up in the red block. Because the big four are Syracuse City, Buffalo, Rochester, Yonkers, and New York City cannot belong to a BOCES. And so what happens is they get the non-component aids, they call it. And if you see, all those aids look like they've decreased when they get down to the dollar difference. But those will all end up being large increased numbers by the time all the audits are completed this year that are turned into the state. So really what you got down there is, if you take a look at, we'll say, some of those A's where there's minus numbers in the difference category, all those will end up being positive numbers and will push the total difference over $1 billion. Part of the dilemma we've got in New York State is that the state budget does not have the same calendar as the school district budget. The state budget runs from April 1st to March 31st, and school districts in New York, they run from July 1 to June 30th. So we've got all these aid categories. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on the one that's the most, I'd say, lucrative for school districts that everybody gets, and that's foundation aid. But here's the problem we're having in New York State with all these aids, and the reason I actually gave you this chart. The governor is trying to say to everyone, look, I know you want more foundation aid to run your schools, But the problem is because the other aids are growing so quickly, I don't have a lot of money left over to pay the foundation aid. So the way I would look at it is you got to think if you think of state aid as just a large pizza pie. So if you look at a pizza and you start dividing up the pieces of pizza, technically speaking, if everybody's supposed to get an equal piece, usually it ends up as an even number. You start cutting across the pizza, keep cutting in halves. And then what happens is for someone to get a bigger piece the next time, someone either has to get a smaller piece or the pizza has to be bigger. Well, all we want is the pizza to get bigger so everybody can get a bigger slice. And so what actually happens here is the pizza's getting bigger in foundation aid by 618 million, but it just does not seem to be enough to distribute aid. So what we say is our little catchphrase would be, it's hard to get equity when you don't have adequacy. In other words, if the state aid pie isn't growing big enough, it's hard to distribute the money inside that pie more broadly because they simply run out of money to spread around. Much of the money goes to New York City. New York City has over 1 million kids, and it is by far the largest school district. It is actually the largest school district in the country. And it has over 1 million kids in that school district, and many of them are very, very needy. And so they get a bulk of the money. But there seems to be a confusion over how they should get the money. Should it be based on some true metrics, or should it be based on some type of historical perspective? They call it the shares agreement if we look at it in historical perspective. And that is that New York City, of all the aids on this page, they should always get around 38, 39, 40% of all that aid. That's what they have historically gotten. And what has happened over the years is these formulas have been altered to ensure that that happens. So some of us are saying, well, we don't know if that percentage should hold because there's other needy districts too. Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, and Yonkers are destitute, as are many small cities. So I think what we'll find here is that there's a lot of tension on who gets the money and who doesn't. So let's start talking about foundation aid and go to the next slide. All right, so foundation aid for the 1920 year is based on a series of formulas. And this is about as easy as it gets. It's where you left off last year. For instance, your 1819 foundation aid base, they call it the FAB, foundation aid base. Everything's got initials. So the foundation aid base is where you left off last year. The problem with using the foundation aid base to start your foundation aid formula is if through the formula you were treated inequitably, you start off next year in a very, very compromised situation. In other words, you start off with a bad number, so to speak. So here's the kind of analogy I would use. So let's just say, for instance, all of you are working for me and I decided to pay you all $20 an hour. And one of the days you're in the break room and one of you open up your pay envelope and you see you only got $18 an hour in your paycheck. You'd be saying, geez, I got shorted. And then another person opens up theirs and they say, well, I only got 18. Another person says the same thing. And then about the fifth or sixth person opens up the pay envelope and they don't say a word. They just start smiling. So chances are they got over the $20 an hour. So some people got paid too little. Some people got paid too much. So in order for me to solve this, I simply say to you, well, not to worry. I'm going to give everybody a raise. So you might be thinking you're going to get a raise over your $20, but what I end up doing is making it worse. I go to my payroll department, I say, whatever we paid them last time, give them a 2% raise over top of that. So all the people got shorted got 2% increase, but on the shorted amount, and all the people got too much money got a 2% increase on the amount they shouldn't have gotten. So I've actually made things worse. So in other words, I'm making you start off from where you left off. And if you got the royal shaft the last time, you're going to inevitably start getting it again because there's no way to make it right. That time has passed. I said, well, I already paid you. I'm not going back. So therein lies a problem with this foundation aid base. Now, next one in the blue is the executive budget. Every year in January, the governor is required by state law to come up with a state budget. And in that state budget, he's got to declare where he wants to send money to school districts. Now, in this case, if you look at the amount is $337,999,931, and he wanted to give school districts a 1.84% increase. Now, the bad part about that, of course, is it's not even an rate of inflation, which exceeds 2% in New York. But to make it worse, almost all the money went to New York City because there are 674 school districts getting aid. New York City is one of them. Now, it may be the largest, but it's not the only. And so what it did is, by doing that, he put pressure on the legislature to fill in. If they wanted to add more money, they would have to add more money to the budget, and there's where the yellow part comes in. And so the legislature added another $280 million to the budget, and not so much to New York City to balance things out. Now, it's interesting that that happened because most of the legislature, because of the population balance in New York, rightfully, comes from New York City. But a lot of the money went to the big four cities and some of the small cities, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Then there's a correction factor. The problem is that school finances keep changing. So the governor, his budget in January is based on data submitted in October to the state education department. But the legislature's budget is based on data submitted in February. So in other words, you could have had more special ed kids or changed in enrollment or some other factor that could have happened that could have changed the metrics in the formula. So there's a little correction that occurs, and there's the total increase, $618 million and change, and it ended up at 3.36. But that's the average is 3.36. So I'm going to give you a statistical definition of the word average. My head is in the oven, my feet are in the freezer, and on average, I feel just fine. That's exactly what an average is. That's a nice way to remember an average. So what happens is some people got 10, 15% increase, and other people got less than 1%, but it averages out to 3.36. So we're starting to wonder, what about the equity here? Let's take a look at pieces of the formula and try and figure out what they actually did either to us or for us. Next slide, please. So this is basically a graphic representation of state aid in terms of total state aid versus foundation aid increases. So the blue bars represent the total amount of foundation aid increase, or excuse me, total amount of foundation aid, and the orange bars at the bottom represent the increase from the previous year. If you'll notice, in the first set of data, in the increase from it's 617 million, then it goes to 699, then 617, then 618. So what's actually happening here is, even though the foundation aid amount that's distributed is greater, it's not moving by much. So in other words, if you wanted a bigger piece of the pizza, state government can claim we're making a bigger pizza, but it's not so big as to give everybody a bigger slice. I hope that makes sense to you. This pizza thing comes in handy for me because this stuff's going to get complicated pretty quickly. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so there are first four parts really to the foundation aid formula that we've got to consider. And they're all under Education Law 3602 and Education Law 211. So what actually happens here, what they're trying to do is achieve four things. One is that they want an amount, a state specified expenditure per pupil called the adjusted foundation aid amount. In other words, they say what we probably ought to be doing as a state is giving every district a certain amount of money, X amount of dollars per child that they have before we do anything. In other words, before we think of any other part of the formula, we ought to come up with an amount that we should give per child. We'll talk about that in a second. The initials for this is the AFA, the adjusted foundation aid amount. The second thing is they say, look, it's not just the state's responsibility to educate these kids. We've got to figure out exactly what should be the district's share or the district's responsibility financially to educate these kids. In other words, we might be able to figure out how much a kid needs to actually be educated, But maybe what we should do is the state should only pay the difference between what the expected local minimum contribution is per pupil from the school district, and we just pay the difference. Then 4 is the selected total aidable foundation pupil units, known as the TAFPU. Okay, now the TAFPU, we all have initials for everything, and we call these things these weird names, and you'll be hearing them throughout my presentation. But the selected total aidable foundation pupil units is really a combination of things. For instance, here's how it started. It started something known as a total aidable pupil unit and a total aidable weightable pupil unit. So let's make it up. So we've got all these kids in school. Do they all cost an equal amount to educate? Probably not. Way back in the 70s and 80s, people started saying, you know, a physics book's very expensive. And don't forget, in those days, kindergarten's still not mandated. It wasn't mandated then. There were very few schools that had kindergarten, by the way. And there was no pre-K. So basically, you're looking at usually first grade through sixth grade education. So they thought it was much more expensive to educate high school kids. So he said, you know what we'll do is we'll count all the kids as one, but when we work out how much money a district should get, let's count high school kids, 7 through 12 kids, as 1.25 kids. So it's very possible you could have a school district had 1,000 kids in it, but when it came down to the weighting of these kids, it looked like you maybe have had 1,100 kids in because of the way they were weighted. And when you're paying a dollar amount per kid and the kid is weighted more, that kid becomes more valuable, you get more money for that kid. So when he started figuring out these formulas, they started saying, yeah, but you know what? There's also special ed kids. It's not just high school and elementary, special ed. They came up with a weighting for special ed kids. And somebody said, yeah, but we also have English language learners. Those kids are more expensive to educate. So they came up with a weighting for English language learners. And somebody said, yeah, but you know what? We're dealing with that local contribution. I mean, for heaven's sakes, my district is poor, and I think there ought to be weighting for poor kids, kids who maybe get a free and reduced price lunch. We call it FRIP, free and reduced price lunch. Maybe we ought to weight those kids more. And somebody said, well, yeah, but we also have community poverty. It's just not about the kids. It's about the community's ability to pay. So they said, we ought to start using census information. And somebody else said, yeah, but wait a minute. You know, we only have so much property here to tax. Somebody said, geez, that's a good point. But somebody else said, that's true. But, you know, we only have limited income here. So they started counting income and property values. So you can see how all of a sudden the formula is going to get very, very complicated in a short period of time. So let's take a look at it and go to the next slide. Okay, let's look at this AFA. All right, so what we've got is a little formula right underneath AFA. It's the foundation aid amount times the CPI change times the phase-in foundation 8% times the regional cost index times the pupil needs index. So just to get this first number, we got to do all this math. So let's explain the math. The foundation aid amount is really where we left off last year with the AFA. We multiply it times a CPI change. Now, if you look at this little chart down at the bottom, you'll notice in the section that's highlighted in blue, you'll see that we start off with a foundation aid amount, then we multiply it times the CPI, and you see in 7/8. And then what we did is we had that amount, and then we multiplied times the phase-in foundation percent. Now, where do these numbers come from? Well, the first number, the foundation aid amount, you see a little asterisk next to certain years. And that's because they reflected a statistical analysis known as the successful schools model. So what they did, believe it or not, is about 2003, 4, 5, they started trying to seek out what would be known as successful schools. Well, what was defined as a successful schools? Well, not to elaborate too much on it, but basically they were looking at school districts that were graduating 85% of their kids and meeting the New York State standards at the time with Regents exams and have a high level or number of kids hitting mastery at 85%. So they said, how much does it cost in those school districts to educate those kids? Then they allowed for factors such as economy of scale and size and how rural they were or how urban they were and all kinds of things. And they somehow came up with a number, $4,695 to start with. I was sitting at a table watching this experiment go on, and I had a lot of questions about it. But the thing is I think we had to start someplace. So everybody agreed, well, let's just start here. So they multiplied it times the 12% inflation rate at the time and came up with the 52.58. Then going across, they said, well, look, we're going to have to phase this in because we don't have enough money to put into the pizza all at once. So let's phase it in at 7.68%. And so they came up with a new number. And so what they did is they multiply all these out. And then the next year in 8-9, they start off with the 52.58. They multiply it all out and they came up with 54.10 and so on. And every couple of years, you'll see a little asterisk there. And they went back to the successful schools model. Well, that trend went on during those blue period years, those years, all the way until you get to 2015-16. Then they try and use the successful schools model again. And they come up with the number where they left off was around 63.34 is the new model because they did the experiment over. And they multiplied times inflation, but inflation was hardly moving. And then what happens is they multiply times a phase-in percent of 1, the number 1. You'll see them all in red down there. So for the last 4 years, they've decided not to up the ante. And why would there be a phase-in factor? The idea behind the phase-in factor was, wait a minute, we keep increasing the standards. Wait a minute, we keep increasing the mission. Wait a minute, we keep increasing the mandates the schools have to do. We keep increasing the reporting. So schools becoming so more expensive, we have to phase some of this money in. The last 4 years, they used the number 1 to phase it in. So what happens is all we're doing is getting an inflation factor and no phase in. So even though our mission is growing, now we got to deal with safety plans and security kiosks. We've got the cameras on buses. We've got defibrillators all over the place. We've got tons of reporting requirements. We got the property tax report card. We've got the tax cap calculations. We've got all these extra things to do, but they refuse to phase in more money because of these new mandates. So what's happened, it has stymied the growth of the AFA. So what has happened, it limits the ability to grow the increase in foundation aid right off the bat. So right off the bat in the formula, the state limits the growth of this money arbitrarily on their own. So that takes care of the 3 parts of the formula at the beginning, but what's this regional cost index business? Well, somebody said, well, wait a minute. And for you people down in the Bronx and the Queens and so on down there in New York City, the cost of living down there and the cost of labor is particularly higher than it is in the rest of the state. So they decided to do what they call a labor study. They call it the Regional Cost Index, the RCI. And what they decided to do was rank all the areas of the state by basically the cost of labor. And so what they found out was the Mohawk Valley where I live and where some of you live, especially the person who lives near Verona and MRC, you come in at a whopping 1 on the RCI. So you're the bottom. In other words, your labor costs are the lowest in the state. And by the way, so is the North Country. But every single section of the state, not county, but every section of the state was given a regional cost index. New York City, by the way, was given an index of 1.425. So let's do a little 8th grade math and see if we can figure out the impact of this number. So I got a foundation aid amount multiplied times a CPI that's hardly moving, times a phase-in number that's 1, and I'm in the Mohawk Valley, times the regional cost index is 1, my number is not going to move very much. But if I have a foundation aid amount that we left off times a 2% inflation with a phase-in of 1, times a regional cost factor of Long Island and New York City of 1.425, my number is going to move a lot. So therefore, built in there with this regional cost index is certain money will automatically go to certain parts of the state because of the labor costs. Now, it sounds a little bit equitable. To me, it sounds like it's not a bad idea, but why did they use a labor index rather than a cost of living index? Well, they wanted to use a labor because what they wanted to do was stymie the increase in labor costs in schools because they don't want to do anything with the Taylor Law. They don't want to do anything with Triborough, and you're all teachers. By the way, I used to be a teacher union president. And whenever I ask teachers, can you think of a time when you're not going to get a raise? They never seem to be able to think of a time. That's because technically most of this is on automatic pilot. So to slow down, they thought to slow down these costs, they would actually slow down the support from the state. So what's actually happened is turned into really a taxpayer burden. So this is becoming quite a problem. Now, here's the other problem with the regional cost index. That index has not been updated since 2006.
Ooh.
So all the data is 13 years old and therefore not very reliable. Then there's the next part of the formula called the pupil needs index. And it gets pretty complicated too. But before we hit that one, let's go to the next slide and take a look at that RCI.
So far, so
So at
good.
the bottom left-hand corner, there's the RCI and there's the different areas. 2006 index. So the capital district is at a 1.124, Southern Tier 1.045, and so on. Everybody see it? So what actually happens is a multiplier. Now let's do the 8th grade math routine. So 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 plus 4 is 8. 8 plus 8 is 16. 16 plus 16 is 32. 32 plus 32 is 64. 64 plus 64, 128. 128 plus 128, 256. What easy math, right? So we went about eight operations. Let's do it when we multiply the numbers. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 16, 256. 256 times 256. Anyone? You see how now the values or the relative worth of that number grows tremendously, kind of logarithmically compared to arithmetically. So this multiplier number means a lot, but what it does is it cripples the Mohawk Valley and the North Country because they're ones. I got to believe these days that the North Country would be more than a 1. Somebody always on every index has to be at least a 1. So I'm sure the Mohawk Valley is still a 1. Our labor costs are pretty low. The other reason they chose labor, by the way, for the index is they didn't want teacher salaries to affect the index. In other words, you could actually make your index go up higher if you gave everybody bigger raises. Excuse me, I got a little allergy thing here. Hold on. Chuck, can you move it over to the other side of the page? Okay, now here's the part where it gets really fun. Now we start getting into a little bit more math. Everybody see this? This is the pupil needs index. It's 1 plus the extraordinary needs percent with a min and max, with a min of 1 and a max of 2. So the formula is the extraordinary needs count, which is the base year of K-12 public school enrollment times 100. Now here's the interesting thing. See the word enrollment. Almost all the districts that you represent, except for those in New York City, have lost enrollment. So automatically, every time we count enrollment, your districts are in trouble because you're losing kids, most of you, if not almost all of you. I've got some data on you, I'll show you. So you come up with this extraordinary needs count, and what happens is then it equals a poverty count plus an English language learner count times 0.5 plus a sparsity count. Well, what the heck is all that? Well, look down and you'll see there's the poverty count is your lunch count, which is your FRIPL number, your free and reduced price percent, times 0.65 plus your census from the 2000 census times 0.65. Well, let's back up a second. What the heck is a FRIPL lunch count? Well, believe it or not, in most of your brochures and your welcome back to school brochures, you actually have an application where parents can apply because they hit about 130% of the federal poverty level, and they can apply for a free or reduced lunch for their kids in school. So you take that percentage of your student population and multiply it times 0.65. Where did the 0.65 come from? The same place the other 0.65 came from on the page, and the same place the 0.5 above it came from. Somebody made it up. Those numbers are all made up. Now, why would somebody make up a number? And where did they get the 0.65? They made it up. It's kind of like this. I want to hand out money to everybody, but I don't want to hand out more than $100. And I find out there's 20 of you. Well, I guess that's $5 a pop. Now, it could be, if it was $10, I'd have to hand out 200, right? So if I only want to hand out, I'll just make the distribution $5 a piece. So I artificially create a number to make the distribution work. And that's what they did. They wanted to spend X amount of dollars. And if those numbers were in the formula, they would spend X. So that's the numbers they used. The problem is these numbers haven't changed since 2006, and your districts have. So these weightings of 0.65, 0.65, and 0.5 are perhaps no longer relevant. For instance, English language learners, ELL kids, there's a lot more of them, and they're more diverse. It used to be our major problem was Hispanic kids or kids speaking Spanish, right? Or maybe Native American kids or something like that. But now they're coming from all over the world. Now, right next door to where I live is a district called Utica, New York. In that high school, right, there are 42 languages spoken in that high school. So the dilemma is some of these kids are coming from South Sudan where we have to explain this is a toilet. This is what a toilet does. This is an oven. You don't put sticks in it. So what happens here is the cost of the education of these kids is like unbelievably expensive, but they're still only weighted as an extra half a kid. So to my way of thinking, poverty and census counts and English language learners, that weighting has got to be increased. Now, the reason they keep it where they have it is so they don't have to pay anymore. Right? So that's what we do. So now that the minimum wage has gone up, you'll find a lot of places that paid minimum wage laid off or cut hours of workers so that they get paid more per hour, but they simply work less hours. So that's what's actually happening here. By the way, the census is based on the 2000 census. It's 19 years old. Okay, so that's no good. And then you can see the lunch count is really lunch counts for 3 years running, and it's only K-6 kids. Now, the interesting thing about the lunch count is in your school districts, your cafeteria manager is in charge of getting this lunch count. So a huge part of your state aid is depending upon how the school cafeteria lunch lady there basically does her work. So you've got millions of dollars based on the lunch lady's computation and what she does for a living. So there are the definitions down there. The sparsity count is an attempt to make sure that aid goes to places that have low enrollment but have high square miles. For instance, up in the Adirondacks, there are school districts that may have only, I'm going to make this up, 20, 30, 40 kids in them, but they're over 400 square miles. Okay? So you can see right off the bat, now the formula is getting very complicated. But the part that's really interesting to me is the part where we have that little min-max up there near the top. So what happens is if we were to increase the value, instead of the 0.5 on the ELL kids, change it to 0.7 and change the lunch count to, we'll say 0.75 and 6 instead of 6.5, change the census to 0.75 instead of 0.65. Most districts that would benefit that way would run into that number 2, the max, and therefore they'd be denied aid. Now, how's that trick work? That trick works really great. That trick works this way. I'm going to give you 2 tests. In other words, if you can pass both tests, I'm actually going to write a check out to each one of you for $50,000. Okay? Test number 1, you have to be online with me right now in order to receive the check. Oh, looks like you've all there. Good. Test number 2, you have to be sitting right next to me right now. Whoop, looks like nobody made number 2. So that means I don't have to give you the money. So in other words, if I increase the weighting in these formulas, I could make sure you don't get it, the money anyway, because you will hit that max. So in order to increase those numbers below, you've got to increase the max to the number 3. So remember I told you the second part was the district share, the actual local contribution, they call it, the minimum expected local contribution. Well, wait till you see this. You're going to love this. So you take the selected full value. What the heck is a selected actual value? When you pay your school taxes, the school district and assessors send information to Albany about what the real property values are in your school district. So you know all the property values in your school district. And then they divide that number by the total weighted foundation pupil unit. In other words, those weightings from earlier that we just talked about. They multiply that times a local tax factor times what they call the income wealth index. So So, but look at the selected actual value is from 2016, 2015, 2016. And that's because it has to be audited. So all the state aid figures here are going to be at least 2 or 3 years old. Now, the local tax factor for this year's aid is 0.0166, 0.0166. Well, where did that number come from? I want you to guess. You're right. They made it up. So this part works for them. So what happens is every year that number changes miraculously, and there's no backup information as to where the number came from. It's just simply there in the formula. And then what they do is they take a look at something known as the income wealth index. And again, look at the min-max there. And they take the adjusted gross income. Now, when you file your state income tax, there's actually a little square on your income tax form that says school district code. So they know how much money everybody makes. So they look at the 2016 adjusted gross income divided by the 1718 total weightable foundation pupil units divided by $268,300. Where's that number come from? That is not a made-up number. That's a real number, ladies and gentlemen. That is the average income per child in the state of New York. Okay? So what happens is that's how they figured it out. But what kills me about this formula is this 0.65 min. So in other words, districts that are less than average, in other words, average would be 1, an IWI of 1 would be average income. Districts that are less than average get truncated. In other words, if you are poverty stricken based on your income, this formula does not work for you. They will short you money. Now, why did they put that min in there? They put it in there because if they went to 0, if that min became a 0, they would have to come up with $122 million tomorrow. So they wouldn't have to come up with the money. They created this minimum of 0.65 in a formula. Do you see now how a lot of this is kind of like, it's like got a good idea, but some of the numbers are contrived. Chuck, could you go to the next slide for me?
Certainly.
And this is the rest of that formula. You can use that, the one I just showed you, or you can use the B part. And what they do here is they have what they call a sharing aid ratio. And if, again, you'll notice there's a max on it. And they come up with these numbers, these sharing aid ratios. And if you'll notice, they've got a little section down there at the bottom called the FACWR equals 0.5 times. The CWR is called the combined wealth ratio. We're going to talk about it. I'm going to show you yours. And what it is it's a measure of fiscal capacity. It's your income plus your property value compared to the state average, averaged. So what they do is they average the averages. So what they're doing here is they're taking your district selected AV, 1718 TWIPU, total weighted pupil units. They're dividing them by this 615. So in other words, they're taking your property values and divided by the state average, and they're going to take half of your income values and divide it by the state average. Now, why are they using the number 0.5? You're right. They made it up because they didn't know what number to do, and it just seemed like, why don't we count property values the same way we count income values? We just make it a 50-50 split. So there's 2 ways of doing it. You get the average property and income value divided by 2, or you take the average property value divided by 2 and average income and divide it by 2 and then add them together. But no matter what you do, you get this lousy average that's very arbitrary. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem with this is, for instance, down near Cassadaga Valley, where Cassadaga Valley is, there's a district known as Chautauqua Lake. All right, now Chautauqua Lake's on a lake. It's a beautiful lake. And some of the people from Chautauqua Lake Central School District live on the lake. But a lot of the lake is owned by people from Ohio and Pennsylvania, believe it or not. And the people live in the little village called Mayville right next to the lake. They don't make much money. But the lake property is so valuable. So what happens to them? So here's how this works. Let's just say, for instance, the average property value in your district was $100,000. And the average property value in the state of New York per pupil was $200,000. You would be half the state average, correct? So you'd be at a 0.5. Let's just say your average income in your school district was $100,000, and the state average income was $200,000. You'd be at a 0.5. You add 0.5 and 0.5 together, you get a 1, divide by 2, and you're half the state average, CWR, combining the wealth ratios, in other words, the wealth ratio for income and the wealth ratio for property value. And what happens is you're half the fiscal capacity of the state. Well, in Chautauqua Lake's case, the lake is worth 2.5 times the average property value in the state, and their income is half it. So you add the 1/2 plus the 2.5, you get 3. You divide it in half to get the average, and they look like they're above average wealth. But some of the people who live in Mayville scrape the boats for the people who own the lake. So it's kind of arbitrary. So if you're near a mountain stream, a hilltop, a tourist attraction, or something like that, your property values tend to be very high, regardless of what your income is. And by averaging them together, it becomes very inequitable. So we're suggesting that this be changed. Next one, Chuck, if you could. Okay, now we got to figure out what the TAFPU is, the total aidable foundation pupil units. And I'm not going to read all this to you, but basically it's all the kids you have, including some summer school kids. So if you look through it, you've got Indian students in there, you've got counts of certain non-resident students, you've got full-time equivalent students of kids in charter schools, you've got kids in BOCES programs. You see how it works? Kids who are in special ed to age 21. And so there's this entire list of all the kids that technically are in your total aidable foundation pupil units. In other words, it's counting your kids every way. Now, this average daily membership is an important number. It used to be that what we used to do is count your percentage of attendance. But the big cities, the big four, and also New York City, their attendance percentage is very low. So their beef was, wait a minute, we have to educate all the kids who are enrolled, whether they show up or not. If they show up, we got to be ready for them. So we want to go on enrollment. And then the other schools are saying, well, wait a minute, we want to go on attendance because all our kids show up. So what they did is they compromised and came up with this average daily membership with all these possibilities. And if you go to the next page, you'll see it gets even worse. And here's the word enrollment again. And enrollment's all over, but here's where they start weighting the students with disabilities. The weighted foundation pupil weighted with disabilities. And you'll see that they're weighted at a 1.41 for these kids. And then depending upon their placement, it changes as you get into the A and the B and the C and the D and the E sections, as well as a 0.5 for full-time equivalent for declassified pupils. Now, for all of you who are special ed directors, I've got to tell you that this is important. This is extremely important for 2 reasons. One is you've got to make sure that you stack all the kids that are special ed right off the bat. When I was superintendent, I used to say to my special ed director, as soon as that kid walks in the building, by the end of the day, don't go home until they're stacked, as soon as they enter in our school system. And then time out.
Just to define stack.
Stack form. A stack form is basically a form you fill out to notify the state that you had the name and level of disability and type of disability you have for a student. And therefore, you notify them that you're now going to claim them for aid, for state aid. Okay? So technically, that's it. The state later sends back a couple of forms and some data to you for verification of these, called the AVL, verification of these kids. And then you have to keep up and verify that, yes, this is it. Here's the cost of these kids. Here's the program they're in, and so on for those aid purposes. But I find that in many cases, sometimes what happens is special ed directors are new, and therefore they're not keeping up with this. They're just simply buried. Special ed directors are always buried between annual reviews, special ed issues, and the meetings and all the things you got to do with these kids, including 504 kids and everything else. Special ed directors tend to be buried more often than not. We also see that, I don't know why in a school district, but the special ed secretary is unbelievably important, because in many cases they do a lot of entry of this data, and they've got to know what they're doing. But it seems to me, in a lot of the schools I've seen, they keep switching these people out as if they're interchangeable. But this is a big state aid piece. And so what you have to do is you have to make sure that the state is notified about these kids. And every time their placement changes or their IEP their educational program documents change, then you've got to update this with the state because this is worth $1 zillion. There's a lot of money in special ed, and it costs a fortune. I'll make you a bet. Excuse me. There's not a district here that couldn't cite that they're having general ed funding issues because their special ed population is growing. I mean, it's taken part of the school district's budget pizza, shall we say. It keeps grabbing a bigger piece. And these kids are expensive. There are more kids now with autism than ever before. There's more kids who are emotionally disturbed than ever before. You match this up with high poverty levels and problems at home, whether it's the opioid addiction or whatever, the mental health issues and all the rest of it. This is becoming a huge, huge issue, and it's becoming very expensive. So this part of the formula is extremely expensive. So now we got the foundation aid payable, which is now we add all these formulas up and we start taking a look at how much is supposed to be aided towards you. And that's what this remaining part is. And so, and as you can see, we've got something known as foundation aid remaining, which is the positive difference between total foundation aid less the FAB, which is hysterical. So in other words, they figure out how much they owe you. They compare it to how much you got paid last year. The part that kills me the most is they have this thing called foundation aid remaining. What the state finds out as they work this formula out is they don't have enough money to pay everybody all the money they owe. So so they come up with other mechanisms to actually pay them less. So here we go. So what they do is they start saying, well, tell you what if we altered this part of the formula, that part of the formula, just for this year and see what happens. So they came up with something that's been around for a long time. They came up to use it in a formula they never had before. And I think it's a good idea. It's called direct certification count. If a parent does not apply for FRIPL or your cafeteria misses people or people don't know to apply, your FRIPL number, which is a very, very important variable in the foundation aid formula, tends to be very low. And there's more poverty in your district than you care to imagine. Because what happens is just because you get food stamps doesn't mean you would apply for this free and reduced price lunch. Sometimes it's a stigma. Sometimes people just don't know to apply. There's a whole bunch of reasons. But this direct certification count and enrollment number, this is the state grant school district's access to families in their district that get food stamps. So now they may have a more accurate analysis of the number of people in poverty. So they start using this number in the formula. And then what happens is everybody comes up with a part. Remember I told you the governor comes up with his part? That's called the executive proposal. And then there's a legislative proposal. So without boring you to death, let's go to slide 13 and just kind of pick it up from there. So the governor said, okay, here's my proposal. Here's what I think we ought to do. What we ought to do is we ought to foundation aid is the greater of 4 tiers. In other words, I'm gonna come up with 4 ways you could get aid, and whichever one is the best for you, that's the one you take. So everybody's going, what? Well, then what was all this stuff we just went over for? Well, we'll use some of it. So he says in tier A, it's equal to the phase-in factor multiplied by the positive difference. Right off the bat, there's a problem. The phase-in factor is 1. Who's he kidding? It's like a joke, a bad joke. Positive difference of the product of the selected total aidable foundation aid, the TAFU, multiplied by the selected foundation aid, minus the 1819 where you left off. Now, but because it's 1, what we're going to do is we're going to change it for you. I'm going to arbitrarily make up a new one. I'm going to make it for New York City 11.934%, and for everybody else 0.5%. So guess where all the money's going to go? Well, the people who live in New York City are very happy over this, and they should be, and they probably deserve the money. There's no doubt about it. I just wish the state aid pie that he had recommended was bigger so there'd be more money spread around to other people. So New York City certainly got almost all that money. Now, if that doesn't work for you, in other words, if 0.5% increase doesn't work for you, let's go to B. Well, if you'll notice, there's all these little dots, and what they're doing is they're trying to select districts. And look at some of the numbers in there. 1.5% are eligible. Multiplied times $97.03. Multiplied by $30. The statewide average of 56.3%. Where all these numbers come from? They make them up to make the tier work, so the people that they want to get the money will end up getting the money. Well, if tier B doesn't work for you, how about tier C? Tier C is equal to the, and then they have a scaled amount. What's the scaled amount? It's $173.25 multiplied times 1.30370 times the product of 1720. So what they're doing is they're making up more numbers to get other districts to get this money. And then if that doesn't work for you, heck with you. Nothing works. We'll just give you 0.25% increase. Well, that added up to about $288 million right there in that little piece, right there, all those little things. So everybody's going, what? This isn't good enough. We got to have something else. We got to have something else. So what they did is the legislature hops in and says, oh, well, we're not doing that. We're going to come up with our own plan. So this goes to now slide 14. Slide 14 says, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with 10 ways you can get your money. So now we're all sitting there. I got to believe that all of us who analyze this go, what? Well, yeah, what we're going to do is if tier A, whatever works best for you, that's the one tier you'll get. Well, let's look at tier A. It's the positive difference between 0.75% multiplied times the foundation aid base, less the executive's increase, or the executive increase multiplied by 5%. That's what we call a due minimum. That's to make sure everybody got some money. Well, if that doesn't work for you, how about tier B? And here's where you can start to see they're targeting districts like crazy. They took care, the governor took care of New York City, but the legislature, of which many come from New York City, added more money for New York City. So they said, how about another 9% for New York? How about Buffalo 10? How about Rochester 6? How about Syracuse 8? How about Yonkers 13.5? And we'll give everybody else, look at that percent, 1.37. And why did they have that so low for everybody else? Easy, because when they got through doing the top ones, they ran out of money. There wasn't enough money left. They said, well, if that doesn't work for you, of course, if you're not one of the big four, it's probably not going to work for you, or New York City. So you try C. So this one is the FAB, foundation aid base, divided by the total foundation aid is less than 50%. And again, here we go. Look at this. The pupil wealth ratio is less than 1.1. What the heck is the pupil wealth ratio? That's the fancy term for your property values. Is less than 1.1. In other words, at the state average or less. Why couldn't it be 1.2 or 0.9? Well, because the districts they wanted to get the money in tier C, right? They were less than 1.1, so they had to make it a 1.1. And then it had to decline more than 0.25% between those 2 years. So they're targeting like a couple of districts, 5 or 6 districts to get this money. Well, if that doesn't work for you, let's try D, 2.5%. And you see what's happening here. Look at the criteria here, where the enrollment increased by more than 10%. So now they're saying, well, we can't keep worrying about these people who are losing kids. How about the people who are gaining kids? So let's make that a criteria. But at the same time, they have to have the ELL kids increase by more than 10. But look at the difference in the years. All the years that are listed here and all the criteria are different sets of years. And that's because they've got a number of districts in their head that they're thinking of, and they're actually making the formula work for just those districts. So all this is totally artificially contrived. Go to page 14, and it gets worse. Tier E. Now we've got public enrollment. What about the people who decreased enrollment? Not decreased it between 2006 and now, not between 2010 and now. How about 13, 14 and now? Well, what makes those years? That's because they're aiming for certain districts. And their direct certification is greater than 36%. Where'd the number 36 come in? That's because if they made it 37, some districts they had in mind to get the money wouldn't have got the money. So you see what's happening here? Look at English language learners increased by more than 34% from these years to that year, or more than 100 pupils between these. Even the years don't match up in this whole thing. They're targeting districts. Tier F does the same thing. Tier G does the same thing. See what's happening? Tier H. Now, tier H and I are really interesting. Now, who's the person lives near VVS? Oh, Pamela, you live near VVS? Okay.
Jeez.
Vernon Verona Sherrill is the name of that school district is not Vernon Verona Sherrill Central School. The name of that school district is City of Sherrill School District. VBS, it looks like a rural district. It is actually a city school district. Now, you got to look it up on a map, or I'll show you some data. But I used to be the superintendent of Oriskany. See my shirt? So, Oriskany. Oriskany is right next to the city of Rome. It owns 4 blocks in the city of Rome. 4 blocks. Right next door to Oriskany is another rural. By the way, there are more cows in Oriskany than there are people, I think. Okay, just for the record. Okay, Erica's going nuts. She's having a good time with it. Right next to Oriskany is a district called Westmoreland. Now, we would call it Westmoreland, but the people who live there call it Westmoreland. I don't know why, they just do. That's like in Western New York, there's Versailles Plank Road, and everybody knows there's no such place as Versailles. It's called Versailles. I give up, it's New York State. But anyway, this Westmoreland owns 4 blocks of the city of Rome right next to Oriskany's 4 blocks. But look at tier H. 11.24% of whatever's owed you, if you have boundaries, include all or a portion of a small city. So they were aiming at like Lackawanna, Fulton, Troy, Schenectady, Albany. Do you see what they're aiming at? But who also ended up getting the aid? Some districts that have these conditions. Yes, Chuck.
Now, we talk a lot about advocacy in politics as well. What's driving these arbitrary decisions? Something is behind that. Is that politicians are
yes, well, what they're after is a large suburban district that is destitute, that owns a couple blocks of a city right next door to them. That's what they're after. In other words, they had in their mind for H and I, if you'll notice, both of them are portions of a small city. They're aiming for a suburban district that just doesn't happen to be a city school district that owns a part of a city so they can get them aid. But what happened here by accident was all these other school districts, like Oriskany and Westmoreland, that are just plain rural districts, got the money too by accident. They just happen to have the exact same criteria.
But the
so
question is,
some of this
who's
is
pushing,
weird.
Who's pushing Albany to include or exclude districts?
Well, it's all the senators and assembly people. For instance, if I was like in Cohoes, or if I was near Schenectady, or then there's school districts that you have senators and assembly people, like right next to Lackawanna. Well, look in Western New York, you got the Cheektowagas. Think of it that way. So I'm sure Tim Kennedy likes part of this, maybe. You know what I mean? Where one of the Cheektowagas may own a couple of blocks of Buffalo. Just making it up, but you get the drift. I don't know if they do because I can't remember, but it's those types of things where they're trying to find angles that will send money to certain places.
Yes.
Okay. And then J, look at J, equal to 4 point. All this is just simply made up, all the numbers, in order to get money to go to different places. Now, in some cases, what happens here is some people get a lot of money, some people not so much. So let's go to the next slide. Now, I'm sorry this is so busy, but I'm sure you can read it if it's sitting in front of you and you have a copy of it. But what happens is they simply, what they're trying to do is distribute all these using all these mechanisms. In other words, the formula is so dysfunctional. They haven't updated it by so much that there's so much political pressure that they keep adding these different nuances to it. This is the 3rd year in a row they've come up with all these tiers on tiers on tiers, and each formula starts with where you left off. So if this year, in the 1920 year, none of these tiers helped you out much, remember, you're going to be a little disappointed because next year, you're going to just simply pick up where you left off. So this, we call this a mess. Okay, this is a mess. That's why I think they're starting to hold these roundtables around the state, because they figured out this just doesn't work. It's like everybody's unhappy. We got to come up with a better system. Now, for your part, so I can help you out, the next pages have your data. Chuck sent me data, told me where you either lived or worked. And so what I tried to do is come up with stuff on your data. So I've got Bath, Castaiga Valley, Garrison, and so on, all the way down the list. where you either worked or whatever he gave me for a list. So if I missed anybody, I'm sorry, but this is the list I was given, so this is what I'm working on. So there's so let's go across. There's the foundation aid last year, the foundation aid this year, and a change in the foundation aid. Then the percent change. Notice the percent change in Middletown. Notice it's 10.06. It's by far the largest on the page. Look at North Syracuse. It's 1.71. Look at Somers. It's 1.4. Look at Williamsville, 0.89. And we're going to try and discover why these are this way. But the part that kills me is if you have a red number where it says foundation aid remaining, this means if the formula were to run today as originally promulgated with all these tiers, this is how much money your district would be owed if you have a red number. But if you have a black number, that means you're what they call save harmless. In other words, if the formula were to run, you got more money than the formula said you should get. But they can't take it away from you. Your district needs this money now because it's operating on this money. So Cassadaga Valley, Garrison, and Whitesville, as an example, are really what they call save harmless. So now the state's saying, well, what do we do with these people that we kind of paid this money to? But in many cases, they've lost so many kids, maybe they shouldn't be getting all that money. Well, they have something known as save harmless, and I think Chuck probably went over it. And the idea was you never take money away from anybody. In other words, in that little example I gave you where I overpaid the guy who was supposed to make him $20 an hour, I paid him $21. I don't go take the money back after I paid him. So the idea is they get to keep the money. But the dilemma is that the last column is after all these tiers are done, this is the amount of money still owed or now save harmless. Notice the save harmless money all went up. In other words, now they're further into save harmless. And the people owed money are owed less money, but it's still a lot of money. Now, if we were to add up all those black numbers, what would that add up to? In the entire state of New York, all the black numbers, in other words, the save harmless amount, adds up to $315 million. The people who have the red numbers want that money. Now, what does the red numbers add up to? Over $3.4 billion. So the state, to pay everybody up without taking money away from save harmless districts, would have to come up with $3.4 billion. Well, they don't have it. Therein lies the rub. Now, let's take a look at some of your demographics that got you to those numbers. Next slide, please, Chuck. All right, so here what we've got is property wealth. So let me use Bath as an example. So the property wealth in Bath is 0.444, which means they're at 44.4% of the state average. In other words, they're below average property wealth. And their income wealth, the next one, the alternate pupil wealth ratio, is 0.419. What they're going to do is average those and get your combined wealth ratio. Everybody see how that works? You take the first column, the second column, add them up, divide by 2, you get the third column. Questions? Okay. Now, let's look, for instance, at a couple examples here that there's a wide variety of difference here. For instance, let's see here. So we have Garrison has much higher property value than they have income value, and Hicksville in particular. So Hicksville's property is worth 1.5 times the state average, but its income hasn't hit the state average. But when we combine them and simply average them to the 1.24, it looks like they're above average wealth and everything. See the problem with the formula? Now look at the percentage of free and reduced lunch. So let's pick somebody else out. North Rose Wolcott. Okay, there you go. 66.71% free and reduced lunch. Now I've got to tell you that column right there has more to do with how much foundation aid you get than any of the columns on the page, except for your enrollment number. Next comes census poverty. The thing is 19 years old. So I don't know how good it is, but they keep using it. Now, why didn't they use the 2010 census? It's my understanding, I was told, that they didn't ask the same kind of questions, so they didn't have valid data to use over. And I don't know what they're going to do with the 2020 census, but considering it'll take years before we actually get the numbers, probably by the year 2022, it'll be too late to fix this thing. The next one is your public enrollment, and you can see all of you are all over the place, from Whitesville of 191 kids all the way up to, let's see what we got. Okay, we got North Syracuse, 8,500. So you're all over the place with enrollment. The next is your final budget foundation aid per student. This is how much you are actually now getting in this current year per student. And you'll see you're all over the place. What you should notice is those who have lower numbers there have either high CWRs and or lower FRIPL numbers, free and reduced price lunch numbers. So there is a relationship. Notice the foundation aid increase per student. So you start saying to yourself, let's pick somebody out. I don't know. North Syracuse got $93 per kid. Geez, what are you going to do with all the money? Not a lot of money. The next thing is how much is owed to you or you're in Save Harmless per kid. And if you'll notice, it's not just the amount, it's the amount per kid. So look at Garrison, for instance, is $1,842 in Save Harmless. Meanwhile, Whitesville is $4,172, probably because it has so few students. So what happens, you see all these huge inequities. Next page. Now, this is the deciles you're in. Now, why am I giving you the deciles? Because I'm going to show you graphs that have deciles in them. So you can look up your district and find out what decile you are for each of these things. And look at your regional cost index. Bath is really at 4.5%, while Cassadaga Valley is at 9.1, but Garrison is at 31.4. Remember, I told you it's a multiplier. So obviously, wherever you have high labor costs, you get a bump. There's your need resource category. The high need districts have a 1 to 4. Some of you are 6s, low need. I've got size of enrollment, and then I've got percentage of white students. The reason I did that is because I've done a number of studies, and so have other people, that are pointing out that some of the districts that are getting shortchanged the most are the districts that have high minority majority populations. So this is going to be the new battleground for state aid. Now, this is a problem here. This is your enrollment based on state aid figures since 2010 to the last state aid figure of 1819. And you've all lost kids except for one district on the page. Middletown. Now, the problem that Middletown has is not only has it gained kids, but it's gained a lot of poverty kids and English language learners and so on. So here's what I teach ed finance at Syracuse University, so I'm always talking to my doctoral students, and you got to keep things simple to get the point across. So you had 100 kids in your school district last year. You've got 80 kids this year. How many kids did you lose? Inevitably, my students always tell me the answer is 20. And then I'm sad to say I have to tell them the answer is not 20. So you had 100 last year, you got 80 this year. How many did you lose? They say 20. The dilemma is you may have lost 30 but gained 10. To use hyperbole, get the point across. The 30 you lost, maybe they're all at Harvard someplace having a great time. But the 10 you got, 4 are general ed, 3 are autistic, 1's learning disabled, and 3 come from Cambodia. So the problem here is it might actually cost you more to educate the 80 kids you now have compared to the 100 kids you used to have. So even though your enrollment's going down, and if you look at someone's enrollment, let me look at my page right here. Who's it? Kenmore, you've lost the whole school district's worth of kids. See it? And what did I show you in all those formulas? What's the word that keeps coming up? Enrollment, enrollment, enrollment. See how that works? So what happens is, this is what's causing some of this Save Harmless, is that what's happening is you're losing kids, and therefore they don't want to decrease the amount you lose. So it's becoming a problem. This enrollment is a big problem. Next slide, please. So here's a distribution. You basically know what decile you're in and what your CWR is, but this is the distribution of the aid per student, the increase between last year and this year. And if you'll notice, I wish I could do can you point like to the top number and then go straight down, say Chuck, go from like a 0.25 at $500 and then drag it down to the lowest number at the 1.0.
You
at
want
the
me to
bottom.
drag it?
Yep, just keep going, just like you're doing, straight down. All those districts that are in that big pile up, if you'll notice across the bottom, they have a little different wealth. See it? In other words, 0.25 to 1.0, 1.25. 1.0 is the state average. So here what we find out is, even though some of them have similar demographics in terms of fiscal capacity, the amount of increase they got is different. That's because there's so much manipulation now in the formula with these 10 tiers. Next slide. But the one that's really kind of interesting and holding steady is Fripple numbers, free and reduced price lunch. Notice that this looks like it's going kind of at a 45-degree angle. You see the distribution kind of moving at a 45-degree angle, so to speak. That means there's a high correlation between free and reduced price lunch and the amount of money you get. In other words, the higher your free and reduced price lunch, generally speaking, the more money you get. So Fripple seems to be working pretty good. Are there any districts that actually have the free breakfast and lunch program, the community food programs? A couple of you? Okay. Well, the problem now is you don't have to hand in Fripple numbers to get that program. And I think what's going to happen is if Fripple keeps being used in a formula, you're going to actually lose your advantage because those kids won't be counted. So it could be a problem going forward. Well, what we're after here is we got to have an equitable distribution of funds. As you can see, it's so manipulated with so many numbers made up to make it come out a certain way. It's obviously not equitable. Next, you can't get it equitable unless the pizza's the right size. In other words, you got to have an adequate amount of money you're distributing. Last but not least, we got to phase this in. There's not enough money in the state to do it all at once. And it's got to be predictable so we can actually figure out where we're going. I don't know if you know this, but your school districts do not know what your state aid is going to be for the year after this. They simply do not know. And when the legislature comes out with these state aid runs that I gave you, the data here, it's an estimate. It'll change. They'll all change. So we need a sound financial plan. And that's what we're after in the statewide school finance consortium. I know this is a lot. You're probably drinking from a fire hose right now. But this is why people don't want to work on this. This is why people throw up their hands. This is why people think there's no hope. And this is why school districts are all crying the blues, because none of this is working and it's unbelievably complicated. Any questions or comments? Yes. Erica?
Yes. Do you think they will clean slate it and start over, or will this be a slow process where each step is reformed, or will we not see any reform?
Well, lately what's happened is that I don't think they should throw it all out. I think the basic elements are all correct. It's just the numbers have to be updated and the weightings have to be changed. Okay. Mm-hmm. And if that happens, I think some of the districts that are actually safe harmless would actually deserve more money. That's number one. So I hope they don't throw it out. And I do hope they reform it. The problem we've got is every time they change it, they say they reform it, but no, there's no improvement. And I remember a senator saying to me once, Rick, you seem to think this is a mathematical construct. It's not. It's actually a political document now. It probably started off as a mathematical construct, but now everybody's just fighting for the money. So to me, what we have recommended is a blue ribbon commission outside the legislature who actually come up with a formula that would be more equitable, that would be embraced by state government. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Yeah, Chuck?
We talked in the class about the campaign for fiscal equity and the introduction of the term foundation aid about the same time. Were these problems existent before CFE? Were they exacerbated by CFE? A
little of both. Yeah, a little both. CFE found that, number one, that there was, in other words, is the actual CFE case was really about New York City. And it found out that New York City was not getting its equitable distribution of money. And that the money, even if it was going to be declared equitable, the money was insufficient. So the first problems with the CFE case was New York City was not getting an adequate amount to educate their kids, And the money that was being distributed was not being distributed equitably to New York City. Therefore, it was proclaimed that there's got to be more money in the formula, and therefore it could be distributed more equitably at the same time. So the idea was to increase state aid by $5 billion over a 4-year period. So in the first couple of years, we got about $2.5 billion worth of extra aid, and things were really looking pretty good. Except there was a couple of us, including me, that actually figured out the state didn't have enough money to give us the rest of the money. In other words, they then ran out of money. And that's where that GEA came in, because they ran out of money the year before the recession hit. And then the recession made them run out of more money. So they started taking money back. And so they've never really addressed finishing off this phase in of this formula. This whole thing was supposed to be phased in by 2010-11. And by 2010-11, we were losing millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in this gap elimination adjustment. The way I explain the gap elimination adjustment is the state had a gap. They decided to eliminate it by adjusting state aid to school districts down, simply giving up less money.